The American Green Beret couldn't stop laughing. He was holding an Australian soldier's rifle, turning it over in his hands like it was some kind of joke. The barrel had been sawed down. The stock was cut short. There was paracord wrapped around the handguard and what looked like electrical tape holding parts together. "What the hell is this? You guys building weapons in your garage now?" The Australian SAS trooper standing next to him didn't smile, just held out his hand for the rifle back. "Give it here, mate. Seriously, this looks like something a kid would make. We've got proper weapons back at base. M16S, CAR-15S, actual military-grade equipment. You don't have to fight with whatever this is." The Australian took his rifle back, checked the action out of habit, slung it over his shoulder. "Tell you what, next firefight we're in together, you watch what happens. Then we'll talk." 3 days later, both units got into heavy contact with NVA forces in dense jungle near the Cambodian border. The Americans would learn a lesson they'd never forget. But here's what you need to understand first, and this is the part everyone misses. Because the story of modified Australian weapons in Vietnam isn't just about guns. It's about two completely different philosophies of warfare, and why the guys doing the actual fighting knew better than the brass back at headquarters. Now, before I tell you what happened in that firefight, you need to see exactly what the Australians had done to their weapons, and why the Americans thought it was insane. Because when you first hear about it, it does sound crazy. Standard Australian infantry in Vietnam carried the L1A1 self-loading rifle. It was essentially the British version of the FNFAL, a big, heavy, reliable 7.62mm battle rifle. Great weapon for conventional warfare, absolutely terrible for jungle fighting where engagements happened at 10 to 15 meters, where you needed to move fast through thick vegetation, where a long barrel kept catching on vines and branches. So Australian SAS operators took matters into their own hands. Literally, they'd take their issued L1A1s and saw the barrels down from 21 inches to maybe 12 or 13 inches. They'd cut down the wooden stock or replace it with makeshift pistol grips. They'd file down the selector switch to enable full auto fire, even though the rifle was designed to be semi-automatic only. They'd wrap paracord around hot surfaces for better grip. Some guys even mounted XM148 grenade launchers they'd traded from Americans underneath the shortened barrel. The result looked like a Frankenstein weapon, like something a guerrilla fighter would cobble together from spare parts. And American advisors who saw these modified rifles were genuinely concerned that Australians were using unsafe, unreliable weapons. But here's what I haven't told you yet, and this is crucial to understanding why this worked. The Australians weren't just randomly modifying weapons. They were applying hard lessons learned from years of jungle warfare in Malaya and Borneo. They knew exactly what they needed, and it wasn't what the manual said they should want. In the Malayan emergency during the 1950s, Australian and British forces had fought communist insurgents in jungle terrain. They'd learned that in thick vegetation, long-range accuracy didn't matter. What mattered was getting the weapon on target fast, putting a lot of rounds downrange quickly, and being able to move through dense jungle without your rifle catching on every branch. In Borneo, during the Indonesian confrontation in the early 1960s, Australian SAS had refined these lessons further. Four-man patrols operating deep in enemy territory needed weapons optimized for close-range, high-intensity firefights. They needed something between a rifle and a submachine gun, something that hit hard like a battle rifle but handled like an SMG. So when Australian SAS deployed to Vietnam in 1966, they brought this accumulated knowledge with them, and they immediately started modifying their issued weapons to match the tactical reality they were facing. American doctrine was completely different. U.S. forces emphasized standardization, proper maintenance, following technical specifications. The M16 was issued in a specific configuration, and you weren't supposed to modify it. If you had problems, you reported them up the chain of command and waited for an official solution. The Australians looked at that approach and basically said, "We're the ones getting shot at. We'll use what works." Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because I need to tell you about that firefight I mentioned earlier. The one where the Green Berets learned to stop mocking Australian weapons. It was late 1967, somewhere in Phuoc Tuy province. A combined American-Australian patrol, 8 Green Berets, 6 Australian SAS, was moving through triple canopy jungle when they walked into an NVA ambush. 30 to 40. NV. A soldiers, well-positioned, with interlocking fields of fire. The Americans had M16S with 20-inch barrels. Standard military configuration. By-the-book weapons. When the ambush was triggered, they tried to return fire, but the long barrels were catching on vegetation. They couldn't traverse their weapons smoothly in the thick jungle. And at the close range, maybe 10 to 15 meters, the careful aimed fire they'd been trained for wasn't as effective as just putting maximum lead downrange. The Australians with their sawed-off L1A1s had a completely different experience. The shortened barrels meant they could swing their weapons fast, get on target almost instantly. The full auto modification meant they could dump rounds into the ambush positions with devastating effect. The reduced length meant they could move while firing without getting tangled in vegetation. One Australian trooper, I'll call him Jack because his real name is still in classified files, was caught completely in the open when the ambush was triggered. In a conventional firefight with standard weapons, he'd have been dead. But he had his modified L1A1, and he did something that made the Americans' jaws drop. He went forward, straight into the ambush. Firing from the hip, full auto, moving fast, Jack charged directly at the nearest NVA position. The shortened weapon let him fire accurately while moving. The 7.62 millimeter rounds, heavier than the M16's 5.56 millimeter, tore through the vegetation and hit with devastating effect. He covered maybe 15 meters in a few seconds, firing the entire time, and the NVA position broke. The other Australians followed his lead, using their compact weapons to maneuver aggressively. Within 90 seconds, the ambush had been completely reversed. The NVA forces were retreating, leaving their dead behind. The Americans were stunned. They'd been trained that you don't charge into an ambush. You take cover, return fire, call for support. But the Australians had done exactly that, and it had worked because their weapons were optimized for exactly that kind of aggressive close-quarters fighting. After the contact, the Green Beret team leader who'd been mocking Australian weapons 3 days earlier walked over to Jack. "Can you show me how to do that to my rifle?" Now I need to tell you something the official histories don't emphasize, and this is where the story gets really interesting from a tactical perspective. The Australian modifications weren't just about weapon length. They'd also figured out ammunition loads that worked better for jungle fighting. Standard military load was 7 20-round magazines, 140 rounds total. The Australians often carried 12 to 15 magazines because they knew jungle firefights were short, intense, and consumed ammunition fast. The weight penalty was worth it because in those critical first seconds of contact, having more immediately available firepower could mean the difference between winning and losing the firefight. They'd also modified their carrying systems. While Americans were using issued magazine pouches, Australians were using captured Chinese chest rigs that held magazines more accessible. They'd wrap tape around magazines to mark tracer rounds or different ammunition types. They'd modify slings for faster weapon transitions. Every single modification was based on actual combat experience, not theory or doctrine. And it worked. But here's where it gets complicated. Because now, watch what happens when word about these modifications spreads through American Special Forces units. Some American soldiers started copying Australian modifications. They'd saw down M16 barrels, modify stocks, jury rig full auto capability. And it worked, sometimes. But other times it failed catastrophically because they didn't understand the underlying principles. The Australians weren't just randomly cutting down weapons. They understood the ballistics, the gas systems, the pressure curves. They knew that shortening a barrel changed the weapon's behavior, and you had to compensate. They'd tested their modifications extensively before deploying them in combat. Americans copying these modifications without that knowledge base sometimes created dangerous, unreliable weapons. Barrels cut too short that couldn't build enough gas pressure to cycle reliably. Modified gas systems that caused malfunctions. Unsafe selector modifications that could cause unintended full auto fire. This led to an interesting situation where official Army channels were condemning weapon modifications as dangerous, while simultaneously, experienced Special Forces operators were trying to figure out how to do what the Australians were doing. The solution came from an unexpected direction. Some American armorers working with Australian advisors developed modification packages that could be applied to MA-16S safely. These weren't officially sanctioned, but they spread through Special Forces units via informal channels. By late 1968, you'd see American MACV SOG teams carrying weapons that looked suspiciously similar to Australian modified rifles. Shortened barrels, modified stocks, non-standard configurations. The official line was still that modifications were prohibited. The reality was that operators were doing whatever worked. Now here's the part that really shows you how different Australian and American military cultures were. When American commanders discovered that soldiers were modifying weapons, there were investigations, reprimands, concerns about liability and safety. When Australian commanders discovered their SAS troopers were modifying weapons, the response was basically, "Does it work? Are you killing the enemy? Good. Carry on." This cultural difference extended to other equipment too. Australians in Vietnam were notorious for using whatever worked, regardless of whether it was officially issued. They'd wear captured NVA gear if it was more suitable for the jungle. They'd use Chinese weapons if they preferred them. They'd modify, adapt, improvise constantly. American doctrine emphasized uniformity and standardization. Australian doctrine emphasized effectiveness and pragmatism. In the specific environment of Vietnam, unconventional warfare, jungle terrain, small unit operations, the Australian approach had serious advantages. But, and this is important, the Australian approach only worked because they had experienced leadership that understood the difference between useful modification and dangerous improvisation. An SAS warrant officer with 10 years of jungle warfare experience could tell immediately if a weapon modification was sound or dangerous. A 19-year-old conscript making the same modifications without that knowledge base could create a weapon that would blow up in his face. This is why when American soldiers tried to copy Australian modifications without proper guidance, results were mixed. The modifications themselves weren't magic. They were the product of decades of accumulated jungle warfare expertise. Let me tell you about one more incident that perfectly captures this whole situation. Late 1968, a joint American-Australian operation near the Cambodian border. The Australian SAS team had weapons that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts, shortened barrels, modified stocks, non-standard accessories. The American team had pristine, by-the-book M16S and CAR-15S. They got into heavy contact. The Australian weapons worked flawlessly. One of the American M16 jammed, chronic problem in Vietnam. The M16's reputation for unreliability was well documented. An Australian handed over his backup weapon, a modified L1A1, to the American whose rifle had failed. That American soldier later said it was the most effective weapon he'd ever fired in combat. Not because it was objectively better than an M16 in all situations, but because it was perfectly optimized for the specific type of fighting they were doing. Close range, high intensity, dense jungle. When they got back to base, that soldier tried to keep the Australian rifle. "Can I just not give this back?" The Australian laughed. "Mate, that weapon's serial number is tracked. If I come back without it, I'm explaining to the battalion commander where his rifle went. But I can show you how to do the same thing to yours." And that's exactly what happened. Informal knowledge transfer from Australians who'd been doing jungle warfare for decades to Americans who were learning on the job. Not through official channels or training programs, but soldier to soldier in the field, where the learning curve was measured in survival. The Pentagon never officially acknowledged that Australian weapon modifications were superior for jungle warfare. To do so would have been admitting that their own doctrine and equipment issue policies were flawed. But the soldiers knew. And by the end of the war, if you looked at American Special Forces weapons in Vietnam, you'd see a lot of Australian influence in how they were configured. Today, modern military weapons incorporate many of the principles Australian SAS were using in Vietnam. Shorter barrels for CQB, modular designs that let operators configure weapons for specific missions, emphasis on reliability over theoretical accuracy. The idea that the guys actually doing the fighting should have input into weapon configuration. That all seems obvious now. In 1967, when American Green Berets were mocking Australian modified weapons, it was revolutionary. The Australians proved their point the only way that matters in combat, by winning firefights and bringing their people home alive. And eventually, even the skeptics had to admit, maybe those crazy Australians with their sawed-off rifles actually knew what they were doing. If this story showed you how much tactical innovation actually happened at the ground level in Vietnam, you need to watch my video on the tunnel rats, why only certain soldiers could hunt VC underground. It's about another aspect of Vietnam where the official doctrine was useless and soldiers had to figure out what actually worked through trial and error. The psychological profile required for tunnel fighting will blow your mind.